Welcome, everyone. I'm Costain, the chief editor of 8.9.com and the founder of the Food and Global Security Network. Now, I'm feeling very privileged to be here with you all today for this interactive conversation about the consensus on food, farming and nature. And I'm joined by three fabulous panelists, each representing one of the organizations behind the consensus. Now, this evening, we're going to discuss what's happened up until now, what the consensus means for the organisations involved, and what impact it could have for farmers, businesses, and the public. Humanity is facing enormous change, with economic, ecological, and social pressures reshaping the way that we use land globally, nationally, and at individual farm level. If it ever was, then farming is no longer simply about producing food. Land managers are at the front line in delivering ecological security, regenerating our natural systems so that soil functions, that rainwater cycles, and that the air we breathe is clean, rebuilding biodiversity, which cascades upwards from the soil and out across our fields and rivers and woodlands, while at the same time producing healthy and nutritious food for people to eat, producing fibre for people to wear, to build with, and to read from, mindful always that we must urgently reduce our reliance on increasingly volatile global supply chains so that national resilience in the face of mounting external pressures is restored. Now, with land use becoming recognised for the absolutely critical role it plays in human survival and success, there's ever more pressure from stakeholders of all kinds trying to push land management in different directions. So in January, a group of farmers and environmental organisations met in the margins of the 2023 Oxford Farming Conferences to forge common ground on a way forward for farming, recognising the vast pressures that different farming sectors are currently experiencing. And from that meeting, a consensus emerged that outlines the steps that can be taken to secure a vibrant future for food, farming and for nature. The consensus brings together farmers, crofters, foresters and other land managers. And this evening, I'm joined by the chief executives of three of the organisations that have been involved in forming this consensus. Helen Browning has been chief executive of the Soil Association since 2011. She is a commissioner for the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission and sits on the BBC's Rural Affairs Advisory Committee. Helen runs a large, mainly tenanted organic farm in Wiltshire with dairy, arable, beef and pigs, and also newly established experimental agroforestry. Beccy Speight is a passionate conservationist and CEO of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, Europe's largest nature conservation charity. Prior to this role with the RSPB, Beccy was chief executive of the Woodland Trust, and before that, she was director for the East Midlands and Midlands regions of the National Trust. Martin Lyons is the chief executive of the Nature Friendly Farming Network, a farmer-led grassroots organisation that champions farming methods that put nature and the environment at their heart. Martin himself is a third-generation farmer and contractor who grows mainly arable crops on his family farm and rented land in Cambridgeshire. Well, that's your panel. I'm going to lead a conversation and there will be time for questions later. Can I please encourage you to use the chat panel to introduce yourselves and to tell us what you do and to make some comments and ask questions as we go along. Now, we're also going to be introducing three polls during the course of this discussion, which is a bit scary. I've not done that before. We're hoping it's going to work okay. They're going to be straightforward questions with just a few moments each time for you to cast your vote. And then I'll talk you through how to take part when we get to that stage in the proceedings. So that's enough admin. Let's get started. Martin, can you give us some background? What is the consensus on food, farming and nature, and where did it come from?
Lovely, thank you very much, and great to be here this evening. So really the background probably started last year when many farmers were feeling that they wanted to see that drive of change happen quicker and better, and also the diversity of voices that are out there that are polarising the debate around food production, food security. If we deliver habitats on farm, or what about the food that landscape should be producing? So it's about bringing voices together and having a sort of a collective approach and sort of, that polarising debate of consensus of actually the sense of direction that we need to go. And many farmers were feeling that we needed to bring voices together. Farmers on their own could not achieve that really level of change that we want. So where collectively we can reach out to other organisations and the conservation groups and other farming groups. How do we bring a consensus around a food, farming and nature system that is fit for purpose and actually delivers the reality of what we need going forward around delivering food security, delivering more of the food that we could produce in the UK. But also we must tackle our nature crisis, our climate crisis, our other issues around public access and healthy soils. So it's about bringing them together. And that we did a lot of work, and we worked with a lot of organisations, and that culminated come together around Oxford Farming Conference, because many of the organisations were there, bringing many heads of those organisations together to put their vision on a paper and outline the challenges we see and how we see coming together to overcome those challenges to deliver healthy food system, rural vitality, nature restorations, and making meaningful contribution from our farmed landscape for net zero. As farmers, we have a huge opportunity to deliver better. And in developing that consensus, we agreed on the following 3 principles: that healthy natural environment underpins food security. There isn't food security without a healthy environment and healthy soil. That farming is essential to food production and the efforts to tackle nature and climate and public health crises we're all currently facing. And the diversity of nature in farming systems and people is critical for enabling resilience and innovation in the face of a climate change and economic changes. Many farmers have already been seeing the impact of climate change, and we're realising that resilience we build within our farming system builds resilience for society in food production. So it really is bringing that together and putting nature-friendly farming systems at the heart of a future farming system.
Could I just ask you as a quick follow-up there, Martin? I mean, obviously, we're talking about a consensus for food, farming and nature, and so it makes sense that food and nature are the key elements there. There are other things that are important in terms of land use as well going forwards. And when I'm thinking about forestry, for example, I'm thinking about fibre production, increasing amounts of fibre production, for clothing and fashion and other things as well. Are you seeking to sort of bring those people, those other stakeholders in within this consensus as you go forward as well?
We're trying to bring in as many people and organisations and activities on the farm landscape as possible. We want to see more farmers farming the landscape for multifunctionality. Trees, hedgerows, and particularly trees has been almost a dirty word. We can't have that. What about food production? The reality is trees are good on farm landscapes. They deliver shelter, they deliver food. How do we have a multifunctional landscape right across the UK that delivers the best it can from that landscape, that rewards, farmers get rewarding for that multifunctionality, getting fair rewards for biodiversity and carbon and trees and other things. But also not just here, we must get the trade deals and other parts done, so we can't just offshore and let products coming in where we're causing issues to other places around the world. So it's not just about the consensus here, how do we build that more globally as well? But we're very much focusing on the UK.
Now, Beccy, why is the consensus important to the RSPB? And do you think that this process can help to better integrate the needs of the conservation movement and land businesses more effectively? Beccy, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was too gripped by what Martin was saying. Yeah, I certainly hope so. So why were we even interested in this? Well, it's because of some of the problems that you were outlining in your introduction. So, we know there's a climate crisis, we know there's a nature crisis, we know there's a crisis for our water quality at the moment, we know we're not eating healthy enough food, and farming really absolutely sits at the heart of the solution to a lot of this for us. That's globally, but also in the UK. We know that farmland makes up 70% of our land here in the UK. So if we can't get farming kind of working at the heart of these solutions, then we really are stuffed. So that's really why we're so interested in it. And I don't have to rehearse the stats around kind of nature decline, I hope, but 15% of our species in the UK are at risk of extinction. 41% are in severe decline. So sitting here in this kind of very nature depleted UK, it feels like we've got to find some solutions, and this was a very obvious place for us at the RSPB in terms of trying to find those solutions, because farming is absolutely essential to kind of driving things in the right direction. But we know farming's facing challenges, right? We've got kind of huge cost implications coming through at the moment. We hear about those every day. We know farming itself is suffering from the impacts of climate change. We've got ecosystems declining, and and kind of lots of kind of uncertainty, I think, in the policy world and in the public support for farming. So we need to get those things moving in the right direction for farming in order to achieve what the RSPB wants to see, which is a world that's thriving for nature and is thriving for people as well. So we need to get all of that shifting in the right direction. So that's the right policies, the right levels of funding, a kind of transparent and fairer supply chains for farming, and real public buy-in to this shift. That's what we want to see. And I think it was about the consensus for us was about trying to build more certainty and more confidence around this voice in farming. We hear a lot of a kind of a more what I would call a more generic voice in farming. We hear a lot from that voice, and that's not to dismiss it at all, but there's such a strong voice coming from nature-friendly farming. We really wanted to kind of give that more confidence, more certainty, so that when we're going to kind of policymakers and we're going to funders, you've got that kind of sense of a real strong position that is shared across partners. And one of the things I love about the consensus is when you look on the back of it, the printed edition of it, there's not just the names of organizations, all very worthy, like our organizations as we sit here, but there are the names of farmers who really support this, and that is so important. It needed to feel like a grassroots movement for it to succeed for us.
Helen, do you think the consensus will be able to help mobilise a really broad range of stakeholders around a common vision, and also help members of the public who aren't necessarily well versed in land use understand the critical role that land plays in building greater ecological resilience and security?
Well, I really do hope so. I mean, as Beccy and Martin have both said, we really do need one clear, strong and unified voice at the moment. It's just too easy for us all to be picked off and sidetracked into very sterile and binary debates about things. And at the moment, when politicians are now vying with each other to degreen their policies, it's crucial that we show that the investment we want to make, that we must make in nature-friendly farming, in looking after our land, in providing more space for nature, is an investment that will repay really quickly, that will bring huge benefits to society, that's going to actually reduce the NHS bills and everything else, and that we will have on the back of that a healthier, happier society that politicians should be really buying into. It's always hard, I think, to demonstrate really wide public support for the kind of policies we're putting forward. It's just not hitting the media headlines every day of the week. But I think that the work that we've done, that the FFCC is doing, actually amplifying that citizen voice is really helpful in terms of showing that when you talk to people about what they want from the countryside, from their food system, they're saying all the right things, whatever walk of life they're coming from, whatever income class they're coming from. These things really matter because the health and well-being of them and their families, they know that depends on us having the right kind of farming, the right kind of countryside, the right kind of space for nature. So I feel we have to pin everything on coming together, forgetting little differences here and there, but coming together to really amplify and make sure as we run into this next election that politicians are under no illusions, but this stuff matters. It will pay. It's an economic no-brainer for them to invest in the right kind of food, farming, countryside, and to showcase those diverse voices that Martin talks about, and make sure we're together on this and we can't be picked off.
Now, it does seem to have been, and Martin alluded to this earlier on, a great deal of polarisation, Helen, resulting from recent public debate around land use, land sparing or land sharing, angry arguments about the role of livestock or fermented proteins. Where do you think these often false dichotomies have come from? And has the debate about them been helpful at all? And can the consensus genuinely begin to resolve some of these really quite large arguments so that we can move forwards?
I think we have a horrible tendency to love polarized debates, and the media really amplifies that. It's so much easier to put these things in black and white, and whereas the truth of the matter is more complicated, more nuanced very often. So we fall into that trap of actually, to get media attention sometimes, to make these issues more black and white than they are by a long way. Sometimes those debates do pull out some useful stuff, but it's usually more heat than light overall. And I think there's a real tendency, which we really need to push back on, to look at things through just one window. So, over the last, year or two or three or four, maybe, carbon and climate change, quite rightly is a very, very important focus for people, for society, for all the conservation organizations. But we must make sure that we're balancing that with biodiversity, with soils, with food production, with animal welfare, with the social benefits. If we just look through one window, we make all sorts of mistakes. So I think there's a tendency to get into polarization. I think we have to really resist that tendency and offer a more sophisticated and nuanced series of answers and policies that actually will deliver the kind of approach that we really need to see going forward. It's, if we just concentrate on one thing, if we just concentrate on carbon, all we'll have is, wall-to-wall Sitka spruce. If we just concentrate on food production, then we won't have any space for nature. So we've got to kind of look at these things in the round and know that we've got an intelligent audience out there who will understand and support that more balanced approach to the policies we need in our countryside.
And by and large, I suppose those more balanced approaches will tend to be more efficient and will tend to give better value for money when you're delivering multiple outcomes at once, rather than simply, as you say, having the Sitka spruce plantation, which hopefully is a thing of the past anyway. But then, that's creating carbon emissions from the soil as that's sort of getting established and causes flooding as well. Now, Beccy, as such a large membership organisation, the RSPB must be representing people with a very broad range of perspectives on land use. And your organisational knowledge, as your organisational knowledge changes, and let's face it, the science is racing to catch up with the on-the-ground knowledge of many agroecological land managers, how do you go about curating that knowledge shift for your members?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've got 1.2 million members in the RSPB, and it is a broad church. So there are people kind of from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of interests, who kind of support our cause and believe in that cause I was espousing, really, of a thriving natural world for people as well as for biodiversity. I think a couple of things. One is we do quite a lot of practical work on the ground. So whenever I talk about what the RSPB does, I say, well, of course we try and influence policy. Of course we try and look after our own kind of places and reserves. Of course, we work on species, and then we work on science as well. We have a big science team, about 50 staff, and lots of kind of partnerships around science. And we do work to engage people in all of that as well. And I think one of the key things we do really is to kind of demonstrate what's possible, demonstrate on the ground. So we have Hope Farm, for example, in Cambridgeshire, which is all about showing how a kind of what seems to be a kind of bulk standard kind of arable farm in Cambridgeshire can actually make the space for nature. And we can then kind of monitor the changes that we've seen. So you're right, a lot of practice is running ahead of the science, but the science really matters because it shows that change is really definitely happening. So that's one of the things we've been able to do at Hope Farm, is over the past 20 years, just introduce some of the really obvious things, letting the hedgerows grow out, putting in some margins, creating some space for nature in terms of ponds and etc., trying agroforestry, as Helen was talking about, and really looking at what that does for nature. And the transformation really comes, so you can run a profitable arable farm and you can have space for nature and see those bounce backs in terms of populations of birds, in terms of populations of insects. So I think a lot of our members really appreciate that kind of demonstration on the ground, combined with the science that backs it up, combined with a kind of an insight into the policy world that we need in order to make some of this happen. And I think by running across that gamut of topics, we are able to really kind of paint that picture for people. And people are really interested. They're often interested in what it means for them as an individual in terms of diet and things like that. And they're really interested in kind of how they can kind of work with the farmers in their own geographical areas. They're often really interested in what's going on that basis as well.
Fantastic. And of course, Martin, I think, is more or less just down the road from Hope Farm. So it's great that there's a sort of clustering of exemplars in that part of the east of England. Now, Martin, ever more land managers are starting to realise that ecological security goes hand in hand with economic resilience in their own businesses and their industry more broadly. Now, in our own bubbles, it's easy to get swayed into thinking that everybody takes the integration of food farming and nature as read. Clearly, that's not the case. But from your perspective, how much of a consensus already exists, and how big is the mountain that we have to climb?
I think we do have a really large mountain to climb, but there's lots of people going up that mountain and at various paces. There's definitely been a growing awareness that our current food system and the models of production are not resilient, are having an impact on biodiversity, our water quality, our climate, and there is need of change. And actually, the impact of climate on food production was something that was going to be on the horizon in the future. We have seen the last few years, it's here and now. It is already having an impact in my business and many farming colleagues I know. And we can see it happening on the shelf. So it's impacting the consumer, us, when we're going to buy our food. And that day-to-day challenge of how do we manage our farms to be more resilient? And we're facing a unique set of challenges every single year. The weather patterns are changing so much. But farmers are becoming increasingly resilient and recognising that actually healthy soils, healthy ecosystems reduce their costs, make them more viable. We need to see profitable farms have a resilient business and a resilient rural economy. We mustn't forget that we need to have that profitability in a system, but we can have that if we build the resilience within our own system. Remove and reduce fossil fuel-based inputs, many of those pesticide products that keep going up in prices, focused around the ecosystems that can underpin our production and are given to us free as farmers. We are the only industry that is given free asset of soil, rainwater, sunshine, natural assets that we should be maximising, not trying to harm and pollute and cause problems to. But we've seen an increase in challenging policy landscape, and definitely more farmers are actually waking up to the idea that farming within their capacity of their landscape is more profitable. We certainly wouldn't have heard much about regenerative farming several years ago, and that groundswell of opinion. And I've been lucky enough through my role to go right across the UK and meet farmers that very often haven't felt their voices being represented, but they're doing amazing things on the ground. And that's part of the network challenge. And I think this consensus challenge is to demonstrate the groundswell of approach that's coming from the bottom. We often hear from farming industry voices and others, oh, it's a bit challenging. I can show you thousands of farmers are already delivering solutions now. How do we make sure that is happening? And in England, we're going quicker through our ELM, removing that basic payment structure and moving towards ELM, and hopefully getting a really good, fair share of support for delivering those ecosystem services, those other public goods and private assets so we can deliver on the ground. And there's an increase in growing interest in action in this space and joining together, and that's very much around this consensus of bringing people together to show how it works. How do we work across conservation groups and other organisations and work on the consensus of the areas we can do? And that's why I'm so pleased to really support this, because it brings so many voices together.
That's fantastic. I love that idea of the free assets, and that farmers are indeed given these free assets, and the more they're used, and the more you can reduce the costs associated with external inputs, then obviously the greater the opportunity there is to increase your profit at the same time as increasing your ability to restore and regenerate nature. That's fantastic. We're going to move to our first poll now, and Phil, I'd be grateful if you'd make that live. This is the moment where I kind of sit back and just hope that the tech works. I think it has. I hope everyone can see that. So we're asking whether you agree or disagree with the following statement. Ecological security is essential for food production, human well-being and prosperity. And you've got around 30 seconds to make that choice, whether you strongly agree, whether you're neutral, whether you disagree or you strongly disagree. So we're just going to give you a little bit longer there. The question, once again, ecological security is essential for food production, human well-being and prosperity. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to remind our panelists to keep glancing at the comments in the chat so that they can perhaps pick up on some of those and respond where possible. Just a few more moments. I need a countdown clock, don't I, just to sort of get there. But I think we're there, are we? Do we have a result, Phil? There we go. Helen, what do you think? Does that surprise you?
Well, no, it doesn't, because we've got such a clearly, engaged audience in the room who kind of gets this stuff. I just want to make sure that the rest of the world would vote that way. How do we actually take that understanding that this audience has and get it to a much, much, much bigger community? So yeah, great to see everybody's on side with that. I would be sad in this webinar if they weren't. Just picking up on some of the comments in chat. Really seen a couple of people flag the importance of beauty, and I think we do disregard that at our peril. I mean, everything we're talking about is going to make a countryside which is just not just green in a superficial way, because sometimes I think it's very easy to drive through our countryside and say, oh my God, it all looks lovely. It's all lovely and green. And actually, without recognizing that that deep green is the result of too much nitrogen fertilizer and monocrops, and that there should be more trees and hedges and other spaces for nature within that environment. So I think beauty is a great one to bring up. And somebody else has brought up the sort of power of the corporates in some of this, which I think is a really important point. I think sometimes as farmers, we tell ourselves that our job is to feed the world, and we talk about food security in a way that actually just justifies business as usual, without understanding that actually we can get off the chemical treadmill and we can produce all the food we need. That might require sometimes a bit of diet shift, but that corporate voice and that kind of that utility that farmers have in the supply chain of just providing lots of raw materials for other people to make money on is something we really need to push back at. What we do about that, I just don't know. Anyway, enough from me on that. Over to others.
Thank you. Becky, do you have any particular thoughts or insights arising from that result, or what you've picked up in the chat?
Only to add, really, that I think it's not just kind of prosperity and food. It's actually I think it was the Das Gupta review, which was commissioned by the Treasury, which basically said actually all of our activity is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature. Nature underpins everything that we do, and if we keep trashing our ecosystems, we're trashing our own future, basically. So I think that sense in which kind of ecological security is essential for the human species and business. Everything that we do matters in terms of kind of having that underpinning. So I would just sort of almost take it further than the question itself did, actually. I think that realization is starting to grow for people, particularly as Martin was saying, with the kind of huge climate change impacts we're starting to witness around the world now, and the impact that those are having. But I think it's a lot for people to grapple with, and it does create these kind of big overarching questions. So some of the big kind of UN gatherings that happen obviously try and grapple with these issues around climate and nature on a global basis. And then just here in the UK, we've been pushing for a long time, lots of us, for a kind of a land use strategy that helps us think through some of this. But it's not forthcoming. And I just, we need to kind of keep equipping our policymakers and our politicians with some of the right answers around this, because without that, they're frankly at sea, I think.
Martin, any thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah. As farmers, a lot of what we produce isn't really food, if we're going to be honest. It's feeding livestock that could be outside. We waste a huge amount of food. And if a farmer is producing cut flowers, are they not a farmer? If they're producing fibre, timber, are they not a farmer? The role of the farmer now, and I think growingly importantly in the future, is to feed the stomach, the heart, and the mind. We need food. We need a beautiful landscape to make the heart flutter, and we need wellness from the mind. And so when people come and access that beauty, that landscape, they feel better. And then we can play our real role as land managers and farmers in delivering all what society needs and all that we need to feed and nourish ourselves.
Thank you so much. That was very poetic. I must write that down. I'll get that off you later. Our next poll is focused on farming and global warming and the role of technology in enabling us to reduce agriculture's carbon intensity and adapt to the impacts of climate change. So the statement we're asking you about is: new technology will have the most important role in helping the agriculture sector to meet net zero. You've got 30 seconds. Do you agree or disagree? It's the same as before, same choices. New technology will have the most important role in helping the agriculture sector meet net zero. I think everybody knows what to do. I'm just going to give you a few more moments. And we will be taking questions in a few minutes' time, so please do drop any that you have into the chat bar as we go along. Another 5 seconds. And do we have a result? A bit more nuance there. Fascinating. Martin, is that what you would have expected?
Yes, I think so. I think technology does have a role to play, certainly on our own farm. I love my technology, my gadgets. I can use satellites to look at my crops and see how healthy they are. But it really is about minimizing the impact and the resource I need to use to grow crops. I can minimize how I do, and I can focus on how healthy the biodiversity is, my soil is. But I do worry that certainly the tech side is leaping away to give us ever more technical solutions to fix the problem, but not going to fix the cause of the problem. So then as a farmer, I'm spending more money on new tech that's not actually dealing with the problem that's being caused. So how do we use tech in a positive way that delivers the right outputs that society needs?
Quite a lot of variety there, Helen. A lot of people thinking, or not really sure, thinking that there may be a role for technology, quite a big role, and others, more in disagreement. Do you have any thoughts on that result around the role of technology in helping agriculture meet net zero?
I think the question we've always got to ask about technology is it going to help us move towards that agroecological future that we need and want, or is it going to take us down a cul-de-sac? And so I think the question being asked as, is it the most important thing? I would probably, if it was me voting, I would probably say no. But there will be advances that will be really important. And I can see some of those coming through on things like environmental monitoring, actually, allowing us to really understand in real time what's working well, where the biodiversity is coming back, actually then being able to learn much more rapidly what kind of cropping systems are generating that. And so I think there's, water quality, we can be monitoring all of these things so much more avidly, much more in real time using some of the tech that's coming through now. One of the other areas I'm really excited about, actually, because is the area of engineering. So whilst a new kit, as Martin said, is a bit attractive and we don't, can be a bit of a cul-de-sac in itself, one of the things I'm really excited about on my own farm is actually using, instead of ploughing our grass lays when we go into an arable cycle, actually having drills now that will allow us to plant our arable crops into the grass lays, so that we have managed to finally get away from this debate: is it glyphosate or the plough, which is worse? And so those kind of things where we've got new kit, satellite GPS, so that we can actually track those tractors, go down maybe to smaller kit, which is less heavy on our ground, and which actually allows us to deal with more complex farmed environments with trees and shrubs in them, rather than thinking everything's got to be big open fields, because that's what the equipment requires. So much in the past, the technology has driven the farming system. We've ripped out those hedges to make way for big tractors. Now we need to be saying, okay, if we want a more complex countryside, more complex landscape, how do we scale down that? And so things like robotics may have a really important role to play, but we've always got to ask ourselves, is this taking us where we want to go? And look at it through that lens, rather than just thinking there's going to be some silver bullet that's going to come along and solve all our problems. And we need to make sure that we've got the investment in knowledge as well as technology, because what we need more than anything else is a really skilled farming community who understand how to manage the complexities that Martin's been talking about here today, where we can pull on old knowledge as well as new knowledge and combine that in ways that could be really compelling and could help us get to net zero, and to reverse the biodiversity crash, and to feed people healthily and well. So tech has a role, but let's be skeptical. Let's make sure it's taking us where we need to go.
Beccy, what about you? What's your view on the role of technology?
Yeah, I definitely think it's got some huge opportunities in terms of helping us find a way forward. I don't think it's the whole answer by any means, and I would completely agree with everything that kind of Martin and Helen have said. But I am really interested. We did a big piece of work this year about kind of what was driving kind of nature declines, and that kind of old-fashioned intensive farming approach has definitely been a driver of nature's declines, and in particular the use of fertilizer and the use of pesticides. And I think, I can see absolutely where technology can really help us be much more precise in how we apply far fewer amounts of those two things, and that would have an incredible impact in terms of kind of the survival of nature on our farmland, and indeed its thriving and the services it can provide for farming. So I think technology can really help us drive some of these changes forward, and we need to kind of harness it and use it.
Thank you. So that's 2 down. We've got 1 to go. In our final poll, we're asking you to consider the role of government and the link between food and ecological security. And the statement we're asking you to consider is: the UK government has overlooked the link between food and a resilient society. What do you think? 30 seconds. Do you strongly agree? Are you neutral? Do you disagree? Or do you strongly disagree? The UK government has overlooked the link between food and a resilient society. I think we all know what we're doing, so I'm going to wrap this up fairly quickly. I'm just going to give you another few moments. Our question time's coming next. So please do drop any questions for the panel into the chat, and Phil behind the scenes is feeding them to me on WhatsApp, which is very helpful. Right, do we have a result? Look at that. Okay, that's fantastic. Beccy, what do you think? Has the government overlooked the link between food and a resilient society? You're on mute, Beccy.
I think it's overlooked the way in which our food is produced and a resilient society, I would say. So I think there's a sort of a lot of concern about food security at the moment, on the back of cost of living, price increases, Ukraine, etc. But I think the real kind of long-term issue is about how our food is produced and the different aspects of resilience that can either drive or undermine. So I'm agreeing with the question, but I'm just kind of reframing it slightly, because I think it is about how our food is produced that really matters.
Martin, does that result reflect what you've experienced in your dealings with government? You're on mute as well, Martin.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree. There's lots of warm words and good intentions from governments and other politicians. But it's not just the government that needs to think about this and deliver this. I think we all need to take some degree of responsibility of how we've overlooked where and how our food is produced, and how we've engaged with those that are producing that food in wherever it is across the country, and the contribution that food system does for society, rather than just a commoditised food system. And as a result, we're seeing the responsibility of food production move to the supply chain and to a market-based approach. And markets only look for benefits for their own profit and their own business, and that's where government needs to be stepping in and making sure that supply chain has transparency, fairness, that actually what we're producing in the UK is the right balance of goods that feeds us properly and gives us the resilience in ever-changing markets and global and political things happening around the world. And we've seen how vulnerable we are in such high resilience to energy inputs. We've only seen last year, fertiliser, if you're buying it, was £250 beginning of the season, and it shot up to £1,000. That impact in that supply chain and resilience, we're seeing huge shortages of water, not just here in East Anglia and parts of Scotland earlier on this year, but also other places where we're importing food from. So we really have got to have a government that's going to really put food production at the centre and food security, but in a bigger context, not just let's produce more and let's feed the world. Let's take responsibility of the impact our food production has and make sure we put enough on the plates that we can produce.
Helen, do you feel more generous to the government than our audience does? Do you think the government should be given more or less credit?
I don't feel, I think there's a real arrogance actually in a lot of developed countries, in a lot of rich countries, but particularly in the UK, where we've always just thought we can import our way out of trouble. Whilst I'm really wary of the food security debate being used as a sort of stick to kind of continue with unsustainable farming techniques, I do think that we have not really understood how fragile the global food system is likely to become with the way climate change is now really wreaking havoc in so many food producing nations of the world. I mean, it only took a war in Ukraine to virtually double grain prices and triple fertilizer prices. That's one country. And when you start to knock out big blocks of the world with drought or floods or whatever it might be, we cannot take our food for granted, and our government cannot take food for granted. And we can't just think we're rich, we'll just keep importing the stuff. So, I completely subscribe to everything that Beccy and Martin have said about the way we produce our food. And that's absolutely right at the heart of what I'm always been about as an organic farmer. But we need to be thinking globally about food security and food provenance. We need to be thinking about what's our share of the global farmland that's available as consumers, actually, because there's something like half an acre, the most an acre available to everybody on this planet if we're going to sort of eat well. And think about how do we use that land, how do we increase our horticulture in particular, where we know we can produce so many more nutrients per acre than we can do through some other systems of farming. But how do we actually end up with that global equity around the food system that also makes the space for nature, it's equity between people and between us and other species? And I don't think our government or any government that's likely to be in power has really got that yet. And yet it's crucial that we do. Otherwise, we're just offshoring our consumption into other places whilst driving our own biodiversity and our own soils into an early grave. I don't feel they've got it at all yet.
It's interesting, isn't it, what you say there about food security and the dangers that the term represents, and the need for us to sort of reclaim the phrase, really, so that we understand that food security is about nature resilience, and that food security isn't just about our nation, but all nations around the world, and that we can't have food security if there are nations going hungry, particularly because of trading relationships that we have. Very interesting. Thanks so much, everyone, for taking part in those polls. Right, we've had a conversation, we've had a bit of participation, so I think now is the time for a few moments of questions. And I'm not quite sure who I should send this first one to, but it says, I'm a journalist for a woman's weekly magazine. How can non-farming individuals best contribute to all of this? I'd like to suggest some ideas to readers. Perhaps we could try and keep answers to the questions to around 30 seconds or a minute. Who would like to have a go at that? Otherwise, I'm just going to pick on someone.
Well, I think it's really tough, just to chip in. I think it is tough, but it's crucial. I think the most important, I think everybody always says it, but write to your MP. Just make sure that your political contacts are used, and just make sure that if these issues resonate with you, you're saying, look, here's a consensus. Here's something that a whole bunch of people, I subscribe to this, whole bunch of big membership organizations, farming groups, all sign up to this. Come on, guys, these are the policies you should be calling for within your parties. So I think that's just something that everybody can do. Everybody can sign up to this, actually. There's a website. I think we'd welcome, individual people signing up to this, not just membership organizations or individual farmers, but actually members of the public saying, this is a really important thing for us. I could talk a lot about how you buy and what you do and but actually making your voice heard right now, finding every opportunity to do that is crucial.
Thanks very much. Martin, how do we balance the need for public support and subsidies versus encouraging corporate investment, such as we'll see with biodiversity net gain points, for example?
So first, I'll pick you up. Is it a subsidy? What's it subsidising? It's a payment for an outcome, and the outcome was for managing or owning some land. We need that fair reward for delivering the outcomes society needs. that actually, as a business, myself as a farmer, I can't just do it because I don't have enough income from other sources. It's about getting that fair balance right. I think as an industry, as farmers, we must engage more with society to understand the challenges farmers have, and the society to engage to understand where their food comes from. And then we need to have the honest, big conversations around what are the priorities. How can farmers, farm managers, land managers, within their management of the landscape, deliver multiple solutions? How can we help towards national health service? How can we do mental health? How can we have water quality? Farming isn't just about food production. It goes back to that consensus of we need a multiple outputs of our farm landscape. And we need the consumer, all of us, it's not the consumer that are watching this, we are the consumers, to understand our role that we choose in the diet we eat, and understand where that and how that food is produced, and take responsibility, but also communicate that to governments and elected politicians and elected representatives of organisations and governments to make sure the right things are decided. Some of these choices are very tough, and without our support behind them, we see politicians backtracking because they don't want to upset the electorate because they need another vote in a year or two.
Phil, I'm so grateful to you for sending these questions through. It's really helpful. So do keep please doing that. Thank you, Martin. Picking up on Martin's words earlier on, this is a question for you, Beccy. Do you think the general public need more education about farming, food production, and the health of land and people?
Yes. I mean, but I think framing it as kind of education is kind of probably not the way to do it. I mean, I would love more formal education around nature and therefore around kind of food and farming and the role that plays in it. And there's some movement there. There's a new GCSE coming through, etc., etc. So there's some movement on that basis. But I think people are. We did something just recently, which was the People's Plan for Nature, and it was bringing together, a completely representative set of 100 people to talk about kind of what was driving nature's declines, kind of what we needed to do about it, and they came up with a manifesto of their own at the end of the process. And a big bit of the conversation, it won't surprise you to know, was around farming and food, and what was fascinating was how quickly people understood the issues, but how they really hadn't appreciated them before, but they got to grips with it, and they were absolutely kind of saying there's some really obvious things we need to do here, and a lot of it is the kind of thing that we outlined in the consensus. So I think once people are exposed to some of it and they realize that a very green view is not necessarily a view that's good for nature, they completely get it. So I think FFCC, the Food and Farming Countryside Commission, is doing some more work to further this conversation. I think we need to be having that conversation in lots of places. And Women's Weekly, why not have that conversation in Women's Weekly? Fantastic. Let's do it, because I think people really want to get to grips with this, but it's complicated and they just need a way in.
Thank you. Helen, I guess this is an interesting question, particularly with that sort of interface between organic and regenerative. And for yourself, as the leader of the Soil Association, I'm interested. The question is, how do we coerce and compel government to prioritise the pertinent issues being discussed here, such as old and new knowledge, organic farming, harnessing tech for good, etc., and support as a priority, not short-term, but medium and long-term outcomes?
I think it's extremely difficult in a society where we have short political cycles, and yet we need to be working to long societal goals. I think it's a real challenge. And that's why actually consensus is so important. So at Groundswell, we brought together representatives of all the political parties to talk through the consensus with them. And I chaired that panel and put them all on the spot and said, what do you know? Where do you disagree on this stuff? And they basically all said, we agree. I mean, it was just, could have been the most boring debate in the world, because they all actually agreed on the fundamentals within the consensus. And that's what we need, because we need to make this not a party political issue. We need to be making sure that this understanding of the investment we need to make in healthy food, healthy planet and all the rest of it is just a no-brainer for anybody, and that there will be public buy-in, that they can't just keep trading off on policies in a way that's been happening recently. So I do think that this the whole point of the consensus is to make sure that long-termism can start to become a feature of our political cycle, where long-term issues like feeding people well and looking after our countryside are concerned.
It's an interesting challenge, isn't it? The way in which we want this thing to become a really big issue. But as the importance of food and agriculture increases, so at the same time, you get an increase in the likelihood of it becoming a political football. And so the consensus from that perspective becomes incredibly important. Martin, new entrants, here's another question, are often starting small scale, and small scale farmers are still currently left out of government subsidies. That's that word again, government payments and ELMs due to size regulations. How do we make farming a desirable job prospect for young people when so many farmers are living in poverty themselves?
Hopefully the structure of payments and rewards will change and recognise everyone at any scale, so we can move away to those small and support those smaller producers. I think it's about how do we engage and sort of get those new entrants opportunities, give them access to knowledge, land, opportunities. And we know many farmers are also moving away, want to come out of the industry. So how do we marry the two up, that those that want to come away have opportunities as well? I think as an industry, anyone who's involved, it's the most exciting, it is the most exciting industry, and it has the most opportunity and the most exciting future if we think differently and approach it in a more agri-ecological system, where we put food, nature, climate, and all the other things we can deliver. And we can stack businesses. I have someone on my farm who brings in sheep to graze, who's building up his own business, doesn't have his own farm. And how do we think differently, rather than I must own this land and I must manage it for my outcomes? How do we bring others in and work differently? And I really welcome the opportunity to support new entrants, and how do we marry them up to opportunities and give them a lift up and a support? Because those new people have got the vibrancy and the knowledge and a different way of approach that may deliver the solutions we really need for the future. Many of our older ways have caused some of the problems. Certainly when my father, his mindset was about producing to the edge of the field in every single field. And it became very challenging for him as I backed away from the edges. So some of those new people that want to come in may have exciting new opportunities and ideas that puts the vibrancy in our rural economy and our farming system.
Great, thank you, Martin. Just a final couple of quick fire questions. And this next question, I just want to advertise the Farm Gate podcast, because of course we are, one of the best known regenerative agriculture podcasts in the world. And so this question is one that we deal with, in most of our episodes in one way or another. And the question, Beccy, is around whether there's a need to better define regenerative farming and regenerative food, or whether its power is in the fact that it changes and it's different for everybody.
Oh, this is like the rewilding debate. How should we define rewilding? I mean, I think it's what matters is, for me anyway, is the direction of travel around it, and what and the kind of, and what it encompasses in terms of its tone. That is what really, really matters. So I'm less about kind of specific definitions and much more about kind of direction of travel, tone, and how it can be actually delivered practically on the ground. That's where we're at right now. We need to start doing this stuff, and I think that is what matters more than how we necessarily precisely define it. But others may have other views.
Brilliant. Helen, can I ask you, and maybe you can comment on that one as well, but just as a sort of half-minute response, final question, does the dominance of the major supermarkets on farming need to change? And if so, how do you achieve this? A huge question in half a minute.
In half a minute. Well, just to comment on the regenerative thing, I think that what we're really focused on is outcomes, and actually seeing what farming systems are delivering by way of those outcomes, rather than getting too prescriptive about standards and all those kind of things, which of course we've done really well in organic, and that's given real consumer confidence in organic. But I think regenerative is too young in many ways, and too moving so fast. I think it would be constraining to sort of say, let's really try and nail it and prescribe exactly what it looks like. Much better to say what's it actually delivering and be monitoring that. Role of the supermarkets, I think it's an impossible subject. I think the supermarkets are under great pressure, actually, with the rise in online, and they're wondering what on earth to do with all of the land that they've got everywhere. What we need to do is support the alternatives, because you can't actually think about, they've been a very efficient way to deliver lots of food to lots of people. And we've got to come up with viable alternatives that people can really enjoy and get the same level of convenience and all the things they want from them. Before you can say, the supermarkets are all wrong. We need other models. And that's been difficult. There's some really interesting stuff going on in places like Sweden with these kind of reco rings, where really big consumer buying groups, which are really interesting. I think we need to be thinking about, let's trial some of those models here, and grow the alternative opportunity.
Fantastic. I'm really sorry, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for your answers to the questions. Thanks for the questions that came through. Apologies that we don't have longer. We're coming up close to 7 o'clock. We started about 2 minutes late, so I'm going to go over, or allow us to go over, by a minute or two. But let's wrap up, and I'll finish by asking our panelists just to offer any final reflections on the conversation that we've had this evening, or any points that have been raised. And Helen, can I come back to you just to help us out with what next? How can people get involved? And what do you want to see from the consensus on food, farming and nature? What do you want it to achieve?
I wanted to achieve an absolute mandate on the next government, hopefully this one, but the next one, to deliver it. I think, and we need as many people to sign up as they possibly can. So I think I'm ask everybody on this call, if you think you've kind of are behind this, go and read it properly if you haven't done so already, and put your name on it, and talk about it with people. Really try and make sure this is a topic of conversation, that people realize that our future is in the balance, literally in the balance. And this kind of approach could really be an incredibly important political imperative coming into the next 18 months, which is going to be a crucial time as all these manifestos are being written. So yeah, get involved, get behind it, talk about it with your friends.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Beccy, any final thoughts from you?
Just the urgency of the situation, really. We're losing our natural world hand over fist at the moment. Climate change is here, it's happening now. And, the answers, I think, so many of the answers lie in how we use our land. And, if we can get farming really shifting in the right direction, then I think that brings enormous benefits in all sorts of ways for us. But we need it to happen now. So it's the urgency of the situation that I just want to kind of emphasize again.
Thank you. Martin, final thoughts from you, if you would.
Yeah, thank you. I think this consensus demonstrates a lot of shared agreement, and there's a lot of shared agreement this evening about how we can come together to deliver the solutions in many of the challenges. And it's also a vision of the future where we all get behind and actually can support a clear vision for the future, how we can communicate that to politicians and others. And I think we just lost the degree of the sight of actually what we can gain from this transition. If we all get moving and deliver at pace, there's so much benefit for farming systems, for people, for nature, for other things. And sometimes I think in all the noise and the confusion that goes on, and the purpose some people are doing to make that noise happen, we forget the transition, the benefit that will do for farming, for food, for nature, for climate. So we need everybody to get their support behind this, sign up, share on social media. If you're a press or media person, put it in your magazine, share it with others, drive an actual engagement into having this consensus. And let's all get behind it, and let's keep championing it and make sure all politicians and everyone in society understands what we're all standing up to in the collective consensus together.
Thank you, Martin. That's brilliant. Thank you all. That's all we have time for. I'd like to thank our superb panellists, Beccy Speight from the RSPB, Helen Browning from the Soil Association, and Martin Lines from the Nature Friendly Farming Network. I'd like to thank you all at home for taking the time to be with us, participating in this evening's conversation. If you'd like to find out more about the consensus, please visit foodfarmingnature.org, where you can find more detail and you can add your name in support if you choose. And finally, I'd like to take the chance just to urge you to visit 8.9.com and to sign up for our weekly newsletter, which pulls together all of the important land use stories from the last 7 days. 8.9 is also the new home of the Farm Gate podcast. That's it. I hope you've enjoyed the session. I've been Finlo Costain. Bye for now.